start the technical sessions. We have the first presentation on financial literacy and financial fragility. This is being presented by Professor Dennis Phillips, senior reader with the Durham University Business School. He has worked in this area and supports a number of global players in their efforts in doing surveys or taking estimation from surveys of different countries. Some of them were supposed to participate but could not at the last minute. So let me invite Professor Dennis to do the first presentation. I had already mentioned that we are running close to half an hour behind schedule. So let's keep it tight, and let's put our hands together for Professor Phillips.
Okay, thank you for this honor to be here, and I just want to also thank Mr. Ghosh for this invitation to come and present some of the results that we have from the survey that NISM has conducted in 2014, and the results which was accumulated in 2015. And so I come from a team which I would refer to as a Durham team for the presentation, which is Dr. Banerjee and Kamlesh Kumar, who's actually from Durham, and we three we come from a Center for Banking Institutions and Development, which has been set up at Durham University primarily to support some of the work on financial inclusion and related aspects across the world. So we have quite a lot of interaction with a few global countries. So what I would try to do here would be to look at financial literacy and financial fragility and the interplay between these two concepts, and particularly from a global perspective to start with, and then also look at some insights for India. So a couple of weeks ago I presented a similar starting slide to the member of the European Parliament and at the Central Bank of Cyprus, and I had here the Euro note at the bottom. So when I was presenting or preparing the presentation here, I thought what more apt than to put the new 2000 rupee note on the first slide, although I don't intend to discuss much about the demonetization, although we have our personal views on it. Anyway, so to outline my talk, I will first look at financial literacy from a global perspective, and then look at Indian evidence. Some of the things the NISM team have already presented, but this will be from a global perspective. Then we will look at something called as financial fragility. So if you follow there was a financial education forum in Brazil last week, and one of the aspects of financial education that they picked up was actually on financial fragility. So it is not just something that I'm going to present for India, but something that is on a global radar at the moment. So when I talk about financial fragility, we have to think about financial resilience, and how do we actually help or support, does financial literacy support financial resilience of the community that we live in. And then finally, we would look at financial fragility in India and some evidence, preliminary evidence that we have. So the India evidence actually is purely from the data that has been shared with us with NISM, and that's the main evidence we have. And then we would look at some of the evidence from the global side as well. Now, some of the starting slides have already been kind of referred as a starting, so a bit of repetition, which is not always, which is always a good thing, because it actually helps us to get the perspective. So financial literacy, this is kind of the definition, the full-fledged definition is the knowledge and understanding of financial concepts. Is the risk, motivation, and confidence. Confidence is a very important term, in this definition, and to apply such knowledge and understanding in order to make effective decisions across a various range of financial contexts, to improve the financial well-being of individuals in society, and to enable participation. So it's not just the knowledge, but it's actually also the skills that's required, but it's also the motivation and confidence. And some of the things that I will show here is also related to these two aspects of the definition of financial literacy. Now we all know, most of us, that the OECD and the academic literature kind of summarize financial literacy index with the three main pillars, which is financial knowledge, financial behavior, and financial attitude. And how do we measure this in our local setting is the question. So currently we are involved also in setting up or leading a national benchmark survey for Cyprus. So the governor asked us to write down the questions and how do we benchmark ourselves across the European audience as well as the global OECD audience. So that's a question that Cyprus is asking. You will see that Cyprus doesn't feature in any of the studies at the moment because it's something new that they are doing, and we've been fortunate enough to be involved in that particular dimension. So when looking at or surveying or actually designing a survey for Cyprus, we kind of come to a conclusion that many of the questions related to knowledge, behavior, and attitude have to be developed a little bit more in the context of the local setting that one finds themselves in. I must commend that the NISM has done a good job in actually filtering the data, the OECD guidelines into a local context, but we can actually further improve some of the dimensions in possibly the next survey to come. So this is kind of the 7 pillars of financial knowledge, which would include the purchasing power or the time value of money, understanding interest paid of loans. This is without any calculation, so you don't have to calculate for this question. Simple interest and compound interest are the main, much more. Simple interest is the calculation question. Benefits of compound interest is easy to calculate. So we are keeping the mathematical calculation aspects low in measuring financial knowledge. It's not, it has an interaction or an intersection with financial mathematics and mathematical ability, but the aim here is to actually pick up knowledge which is much more of a conceptual base than a calculation. Then understanding risk and return relationship, understanding the benefit of diversification, and understanding the meaning of inflation. In the UK, we've actually been implementing some of these things, but there is also another dimension which has come up, which they call it as the advanced financial knowledge aspect. So this is looking at the financial knowledge of a person, and that would influence the decision-making process of that particular individual. However, also it is important that these individuals understand the decision-making process of the government that governs them, the institutions, the regulatory bodies, and so the decision-making of the players in the market are also important to be understood. So we are thinking about, what does a budget deficit mean? So inflation has gone up. So what does that mean for your? Also, if there's a deficit, how does the government fill that deficit? So there are these decision-making which would influence one of the way you think about the economy and much more, and therefore the advanced knowledge of debt, advanced knowledge of the decision-making of other players also plays a key role. At least this is what we are looking at from an advanced economy, but from an Indian perspective, dimensions beyond this should also be considered. Okay, because we should understand that OECD is a benchmark, but however, we could actually expand upon some of these things. Financial behavior is captured across about 8 questions with similar dimensions: responsibility of a household, keeping a budget, responsibility of money, active financial savings, making affordable purchases, paying bills on time, keeping watch on financial affairs, long-term financial goal setting, an informed choice of financial products. So these are the behavioral aspects that are calculated. And then the third aspect is financial attitude, which is pretty much, I would think, it's a smaller definition of attitude. and more work should be done in this aspect, I believe. So there are 3 dimensions that are picked up by the OECD. One is, do you tend to believe to live for today, or do you live for tomorrow? Is it more satisfying to spend money today or to save it for tomorrow? And money is there to be spent, money is there to be saved. These are the 3 concepts. All these concepts are kind of interlinked, and they all measure short-termism against long-termism. There are other attitudes that also needs to be captured. And so one of the things that we're doing when we designed the survey for the Cyprus government is to actually pick up other aspects. In the literature, there are aspects such as time preference, future expectations, optimism, self-confidence. These are different aspects which we have come across. So one of the papers that I published in this area, we try to measure some of those attitudes, that would govern an individual. That paper was written from a US perspective. However, I believe that attitude here has a kind of a monotonic dimension to short-termism, which picks up only one small dimension. So I would think that in the next surveys to come, we should be picking up further attitudes, further dimensions of attitude in order to measure our response in terms of interventions and our decisions. Then there is another aspect of measuring or scoring this financial literacy. So we have these, say, 21 dimensions that we actually measure, but then we have to come up with a score for a particular household. Okay? So how do we actually construct a score? Simple thing is to actually equally weight all the questions, all the dimensions, and that's a measure that OECD uses. However, we've been proposing and actually developing a new methodology for how to measure financial index or score for an individual. So this score is actually weighted by the distribution of the population knowledge. Okay? So this is quite important because surveys in other countries are at 1,000 sample, there's 8,000 max. We got 75,000 people here. Okay, and also the other thing is that as we already discussed this, we've got a heterogeneous population across urban, rural zones. Northeast, south. We're all different, and it's difficult to actually equally weight everybody across all the dimensions. Okay, so we need to actually, in the Indian context, it is a must that we have to weight the scores by the distribution or the population that we come from. Okay, so how do we do this in this paper that we are writing at the moment with the help of NISM? We have dichotomous responses, correct responses and incorrect responses for the questions. Also, there are ordinal responses, agree, strongly agree to strongly disagree. So there are 2 different types of questions. And for each of these types of questions, we should actually weight by the performance of the population or the difficulty level of the population. So if a guy in the population is actually answering the simple interest questions so simply, then he should actually have a low weight because he understands. So for a correct answer, but if he's actually answering a question which is mostly difficult and people have said, have got a wrong answer, that weight should be greater. So hence we are actually going to be not equally weighting across all the questions, but actually weighted relative to the Indian population. And this is quite crucial when we have a huge sample such as 75,000 people. Okay? So the results I show here are actually going to be from the index that we have actually proposed. So some of these graphs that I would show, maps I would show, is different from the NISM maps we saw, and the difference in the results is primarily perhaps because of the new weighting technique that we have proposed. And we are in the process of developing a tool which we would want to, with NISM for the web page of NISM, such that we can use these tools to market the new measure or the new scoring technique, such that we can better understand the financial literacy index across the country. So this is actually financial literacy evidence state level. We also did some district level information, but for ease of presentation, we have knowledge, behavior, and attitude. And high knowledge is Goa, Kerala, Manipur. Low is Bihar, Sikkim, Chhattisgarh, and Orissa. In terms of behavior, so essentially yellow is the lowest quantity and highest is dark blue. And so Maharashtra, Bengal, and Manipur is high on financial behavior according to the index we calculate. And low is Punjab, Uttarakhand, Sikkim, Chhattisgarh, and Goa. And similarly for attitude, we find Himachal Pradesh, Tripura, Meghalaya, and Manipur and Kerala have high attitude. Low is for Punjab, Rajasthan, Orissa. One of the important things I want to show here is that 3 dimensions are quite different. Okay? We're not kind of picking up all the dimensions are all the same. So the first important point to note is that there is really information in these 3 dimensions for India. Okay, so we're not picking up the same dimension 3 times. You know, so, and we see that some places are really strong in knowledge, but then then they don't really behave much. Or if you look at attitude, one of the Chhattisgarh kind of, you know, is up there in, you know, with yellow, and kind of all 3 dimensions seems to be low for that. But other countries, other regions, other states seem to have this diversity in them. So if you aggregate all these dimensions together, we get this aggregated state level financial literacy evidence. So high is Jammu, Kashmir, Maharashtra, Manipur, and Kerala. And the low is Punjab, Uttarakhand, Chhattisgarh, Bihar, and Sikkim. And I would say that, you know, we have to be careful in aggregation because, you know, it's simply an aggregation of all 3. So the aggregated measure is good as a first picture, but we should always think about intervention at the much more of a minute level. So who are the guys who are actually behaving not as they should? What is their knowledge? What is their attitude? So these have to be understood as a component by component. Now, from here, let's compare what the India evidence shows with the global evidence that came out on the 12th of October 2016. So just a few months back, 30 countries had participated in this OECD International Survey. It covered all the aspects that we have covered in the NISM survey, that is on financial literacy, behavior, attitudes, and inclusion. Globally, they find that budgeting, planning ahead, choosing products, and using independent financial advice were the key areas which were weak. And so the global OECD response and also the message is that such areas should be taken care of. And they also look at the importance of financial education early and ideally in schools, and I commend some of the work that happens in India around schools. That is one of the key recommendations. So the work in India is much in line with the OECD and the global response to financial illiteracy. And regulation and consumer protection are the other 2 pillars that should come alongside with financial education. So financial education itself would not be the solution. However, we need regulation, we need consumer protection frameworks in order to have a sustained approach to this agenda. Now, this is actually comparing the responses from India against the global average that was presented in the OECD evidence in 2016. So the correct responses, simple interest, 55% in India got the correct response, 58% was a global average. Inflation, 62%, global average was 78%. Time value of money, 75%. So we actually understand time value of money rather good. So we understand the purchasing power. We have 75%, while the global average is 63%. Diversification is 58% against the average of 64%. Compound interest 31% against 42%. Risk return relationship 58% against 81%. And interest paid on loans 39% against 85%. Some of these dimensions are smaller, so we have to think about, such as understanding the interest paid on loans is a key dimension, where 39% is pretty low as compared to 85%. So globally people understand much better than we do at home. So there are some of the things have to be channeled across these various sub-dimensions. And we find that 8.5% of the respondents got all the questions correct. which is a small number. Now, how do we actually compare against the global scale? So if we actually pack up these 30 countries across the different scales of knowledge, behavior, and attitude, we find that France, Finland, Norway, Canada, Hong Kong, China, they lead the way with the top score. Brazil, Croatia, Belarus, Poland, Russia, Malaysia, these are some of the ones that actually are at the bottom. So we actually did an exact exercise of the OECD, tried to actually compare word to word how they measure it with the evidence that we have in NISM, and we find that India lies somewhere here. So we have an average score of 12.5 as compared to the global average of 13.2. We kind of rank between Czech Republic and Turkey. So 12.5 is the average for us. The average across the countries is 4.6, 5.4, and 3.3. So these were so we kind of ranked across the global scale, not bad, as compared to the population we have and the local challenges that we face. Notice that UK, where we come from, is below the average. So there's lots of work even for developed nations such as UK to work on. So this is the evidence we find in India. So the next part, so this was actually to benchmark the Indian evidence across the world and benchmark and say where do we stand in the global arena. Okay, that was what we discussed until now. Now the next part is about fragility, and this is actually to ask a very primary question, which also Dr. Banwala alluded to, which is actually about financial resilience of the poor. Okay, so does financial literacy, which is our mission statement here, help build financial resilience among the Indian households? So we want to study financial resilience. And in order to understand financial resilience, let's think about a definition. So it's the ability to cope with external shocks, okay, at least in the short run. So that's the way we think about financial resilience. So we want to compare, in order to understand resilience, we actually compare the distribution of Indian households that are fragile versus the ones who are resilient. So we have this distribution of fragile against non-fragile. Okay, we will let you know how we define this fragility, and this is crucial for understanding the financial stability of the Indian economic system, okay, and also for policy interventions. And not least, but this is also financial fragility is one of the global agendas at the moment. So there is a lot of literature at the moment where people are looking at a specific class of households which they call financially fragile households, and they want to understand how can we actually empower these guys. So how does it stand for India? So the question that we used was, in the last 12 months, have you encountered a situation wherein your income does not cover your living costs? So if yes, then you are deemed to be financially fragile. No is not, and not applicable. This is the NISM question that we use in order to measure this. This measures actually a proximity to indebtedness. Okay, it's an inability to make ends meet. We find that 40% of our sample in the 75,000 people that was interviewed come under this criteria. Okay, so that's a big chunk that we should study about, and it's not a small number so we have variability in the data. Whenever we want to understand a particular class of people, we need enough sample size to actually understand them. And here, in this case, we have a 40% sample size to compare. 34% of these guys are urban, and 44% come from the rural side. Now, in terms of measurement, the NISM survey offers a measurement of fragility which is kind of backward looking. So we are looking at the last 12 months, and we are looking at what happened to your income distribution in the last 12 months, and we actually project ahead or forecast ahead. Some of the literature in this area also measure fragility as a forward-looking measure by for asking questions like, do you think that in the next 12 months would you be able to meet your expectations. So it's a story of how the person feels about it. So there are multiple definitions of fragility that has been used in the global arena. This is a question that closely matches the literature, so we went with this. But again, for the next survey, we would want to capture not just the backward-looking measure of fragility, but also a forward-looking measure of fragility. So these are some of the things which we would want to do in the next phase. Now, this is state-level fragility experience of India, which is on this side, and then on the right-hand side is the GDP. Let's look at the fragility. Fragility across the states. Low is yellow, and then high is blue. And so we get a various distribution of fragility across the state level. And the reason why we actually put the GDP per capita of 2014 on the right-hand side is to show that fragility is not the same as poverty. Or we're not measuring level of poverty here, we are actually measuring the income effect, okay? So not the wealth effect, but the income effect. So it's sort of GDP. So we see that it's not, we have a difference in the distribution of fragility in the sample as compared to the distribution of GDP in the sample. So we are actually comparing two different things. So the question is it poverty that we are measuring? We're not measuring poverty in this case because it's a different animal. Now this is looking into it a little bit more deeper across the zone level. So fragility experience across zone levels, okay? We find this, red corridor part, southern to western side, which has more fragility. The yellow, which is low fragility, which is good news, is actually much more in the northeastern region, aggregated. And I have identified three macro impact or macro things, which actually is important to highlight here, given some of the things about sustainability that we discussed now. Here are three big events that happened in 2013, which this is anecdotal evidence, so we are not measuring causality here, but we are actually understanding the associations on a macro level. Bihar had the major flood that year. 200 people died, 6.9 million displaced. We had the cyclones hitting Andhra Pradesh and that side, not just one. Cyclone Helen, Leather, Philomen, tropical depression Vilma. And then Karnataka had the major cotton failure. Districts in 7 districts, poor quality of BT seeds was the reason. So we can actually see that there is also a macro dimension to this, okay? And that fragility, when we think about it, should not only be thought about from income smoothing angle, but also from a response from a sustainability angle. Okay, so this is one of the major reason why we want to highlight that there could be a macro explanation to this, although we want to understand that even if this macro impact affects a region, there should be financially literate guys who should do better, who should be able to cope better than the non-literate guys. So we have a micro ambition, but we should also think about the macro consequences that also face our country. Now, this is some bubble charts. Now, series of bubble charts will follow because we want to highlight or understand the distribution of the fragile people. Okay, so there are 4 dimensions in this graph. So the y-axis, the vertical dimension, is the median income. So we class people into buckets of income. X-axis, we have the years of schooling. So 5 years, 10 years, graduate, PhD, years of schooling. Then the circle, the size of the circle is the population base in that circle. And then the color of the circle will tell you about the fragility. So darker the circle, more fragile you are. Lighter the blue you are less fragile. Okay, so there are 4 dimensions: income dimension, schools dimension, the population dimension, and then the fragility dimension. We see that, okay, as we move from to the right-hand side of the quadrant, we find that the blue is getting lighter, which shows that actually people who have higher schooling and who have higher income actually are less fragile. Okay, Now, if you look at the major population base we have, which is across the middle, we find here that most of the population base here are farmers, and they are actually fragile, independent of the income base. And one of the little funny thing here is that the privileged guys who have never got a lot of money, probably from inheritance, but never really did any schooling, they still are fragile, because years of schooling has a kind of a positive relationship in this case. Now, going deeper into the distribution of fragility, here we actually now have 4 dimensions, which is social class. So we have the ST, SC, OBC, and the general class across schooling. And then we have the size of the bubble, which is the population base we considered, and the color of the bubble. Darker the blue, more fragile. Lighter the blue is actually less fragile. And here we have a very interesting pattern. So the general class guys, they actually, as they increase the schooling, they actually reduce their fragility, okay? Which is good news for financial education. Now look at the SC and the OBC classes. These classes actually, no matter how literate you are or how many years of schooling, on average, your fragility is kind of stable. This calls for really a policy implication or policy intervention into these particular classes of people, who needs to be supported, perhaps because there is not enough, opportunities or lack of infrastructure, lack of other factors. But we find here that fragility does not really decrease for these 2 main classes of people, which is which has the major population, according to the schooling. So as schooling increases, they still find that these dark blues still remain dark blue, they don't light. So this is kind of an important, so across all these 4 classes, general class and the ST class are doing well, but we have the SC and the OBC guys who are actually still finding it fragile according to so there is a policy implication to be considered here. Now, next we look at the population of fragility, who are kind of farmers and other people, according to their occupation, okay? So, income and occupation are the Y and the X axis respectively. We find that, retired, salaried, private salaried, government, independent of their, as the income goes up, they are less fragile, okay? So this is good news, for the people who have a steady flow of income. But then if you look at these non-agriculture, self-employed agriculture and the agricultural laborers, they actually feel the most fragility, casual labor. So these are, there's an income explanation to here. So the distribution or the frequency of income, the level of income, this matters for these classes. So we find this kind of 2 parts, and therefore again we have policy implications, which kind of fits with the NABARD theme of actually empowering some of these self-employed agricultural and agricultural laborers. So there is a common theme that we find. So fragility or financial resilience should be sort of the channel through which the financial education initiatives in NISM and NABARD can be intertwined into one agenda going forward. Now, this is financial literacy and financial fragility. We have now 3 quadrants, okay? It's small, but I just put this 3 because there are 3 dimensions of financial attitude, financial behavior, and financial knowledge. The key here is that as you move from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, we find that the darker blues become lighter. So all 3 dimensions of financial literacy actually help reduce the fragility on average for the population base that we find. So this is kind of, kind of first evidence. So then we run some logit models to find that both financial awareness, financial behavior, and financial literacy, all 3 components play a negative and a significant role for the probability of fragility. Okay, so the probability that a person is fragile reduces as you increase these 3 components. And we control for a series of different factors, categories, age, gender, income, rural zones, education, work status, occupation, and income frequency. So we consider a huge amount of controls in performing these exercises. Now, the next dimension we looked at was financial advice. Again, this is something that I want to link it with yesterday's keynote speech, where advice was a key element that, was talked about. So we use the question, what influenced your decision while selecting your financial products? And we categorize this into 3 groups. Expert advice, if you've actually taken advice from financial advisors, expert recommendations, or you've actually attended financial literacy awareness camps. Non-expert advice is information from company websites, advertisements, information on the internet. And then we have personal advice, which is from a friend or a relative, past personal experience. Okay? And we find that, and then we run fragility models, and we find some very, very interesting results here. Expert advice actually reduces the fragility among the population base. This is really crucial and supports the theme that we heard from Mr. Sagan yesterday, that we need expert advice readily available and accessible to the population base, and we have evidence statistically that expert advice actually will reduce the fragility of the population. And non-expert advice actually has a negative effect, which is good, but it's actually statistically insignificant for the sample we consider. And personal advice, in fact, has a positive relationship with so if your parents and your friends tell you, this is what happened to me in the past, perhaps we have to qualify these advices we get, because as Indians we love to give advice. We are the best doctors and the advisors here around. So we love to give advice, and therefore one of the policy implications for all of us is that it actually statistically increases your fragility to the future of your income base. Now here again we control for category, age, gender, income, rural zones, education, work status, occupation, and also the income frequency. Another thing we looked at was actually interacting fragility with the financial portfolio that you hold. Liquid assets versus illiquid assets. So if you're holding liquid assets, we put you in a bucket and test your fragility. If you're holding illiquid assets, we put you in another bucket, and then we actually test your fragility. Okay? So liquid assets, putting money in a bank account, savings, cash at home, investing in chit funds, saving formally, informally, giving money to family and friends. Illiquid assets, we said buying financial products, investing in collective deposit schemes, investing in gold and property. This is some of the kind of the crude benchmark that we use for liquid and illiquid. We find that liquid investments actually have reduced your fragility, while illiquid investments have a negative relationship, but we don't find anything significant. So there is a liquidity explanation to this fragility as well. Statistically, we want to show this because again, demonetization and the other policy implications, impact interventions we have, liquid assets, liquid investments do actually reduce fragility of the people as compared to illiquid assets. So liquidity explanation does play a role. So if you have more cash, it also makes an intuitive explanation to your fragility. And again, we control for the same aspects. So just to conclude, we actually did series of tests and some of the key considerations which I just mentioned. I would summarize here. So we measured across 3 dimensions, across of FK, SB, and FA, which is knowledge, behavior, and attitude. We find that India scored a value of 12.5 across the global average of 13.2. We observe 40%, then we're looking at the financial resilience of the Indian respondents. We find that 40% of the Indian respondents were fragile. Southern Eastern recorded the highest fragility, Northern Eastern recorded the lowest fragility. And years of schooling had a very strong negative relationship with fragility. So that really calls upon financial education as one of the policy tool that should be considered, also along with the interventions of NABARD. SBC and OBC class cohort seems to be universally fragile no matter the years of schooling. Again, another policy implication we have here, that we need to support them, and more research needs to be done. So the next surveys, carrying on with the RBI or with NISM should actually think about, studying these cohorts, because they are key cohorts in the size in terms of population base, and we need to understand what governs these cohorts. We show that all the financial dimensions reduce fragility, which is good, and fragility is lower as for households receiving expert advice as compared to personal or informal advice. Now, financial advice is another big flagship of the OECD, and it's important that we understand that financial advice still also plays an important role in the Indian setting. And finally, formal products participation in liquid currencies, do significantly lower financial fragility as compared to informal products such as gold and real estate. So to summarize the policy implications, we find that increasing financial literacy, increasing the access to expert financial advice, and increasing the participation in formal financial products play a key role in reducing fragility and increasing the resilience of the population base in India. So I conclude by saying that financial literacy provides the people with a vision to see and to shape one's future. So let's continue to empower them with this. Thank you.